This is ELEX II. I actually thought it was ELEX until I heard them pronounce it in-game. Sorry. Anyway, ELEX II is an RPG brought to you by Piranha Bytes, the guys that made the Gothic series as well as the Risen games. So it is an open-world RPG in that peculiar European sense that is only available from developers like these. I tend to really enjoy games like this. I didn't get into Risen, but I did very much like the Gothic games. In fact, I've actually thought about doing a sort of retrospective of the series in general because it's just a really interesting thing for the RPG world. I like these sorts of things. I've also enjoyed games like Two Worlds 2 in the past. However, I gotta say, I did really bounce off of this game pretty hard, but I also don't think that it's a bad game. It's just got a lot of problems. And one of the first really big problems, I normally don't start out the video with a complaint, but seriously, in this case it's actually bad enough to where I feel that I have to. The camera control in this game is really, really not good. They have actually stated that they're aware of this and are working on it, but it really never should have even launched like this to begin with. They have done perfectly fine camera control in the past. I have no idea why the camera is as bad as it is in this game, but it's hard to describe exactly how it feels, but it's so bad that I actually had to switch to a controller to make it even somewhat tolerable, because trying to move the camera with a mouse feels really weird and awful. Controller makes it a little bit better, but it's still really not good. The FOV is way too close in. It's like Resident Evil 5 level stuck into your shoulder blade, like way too close. And when you actually move, it zooms out really quickly to a much more acceptable FOV that really should be all the time, in my opinion. And then as soon as you stop moving, it snaps back in again. And it's just really disorienting, and it makes it feel like your eyes are attached to your head by a pair of rubber bands. I don't know, it's just a really awful feeling camera, and it has given me a headache every single time I've played the game. Every time I've quit playing the game for the day, I've had a headache. That's just how it is. I will admit that I am more sensitive to simulation sickness issues in games, so what hurts my head won't necessarily do the same thing for you, but if it's this bad to where it is like guaranteed headache and nausea every time I play within about 20 or 30 minutes, I feel the need to mention it. In the game, you actually play Jax, the guy from the original ELEX, which I've never actually played, I'll be honest, but from what I understand, he is sort of a storied hero in a sense that no one actually cares, which is kind of a weird way to start off, but there you go. And you are in this world that is already post-apocalyptic from the previous events, but is now experiencing a world-ending alien invasion of an advanced race, and you have to get all the faction leaders on board and actually get some sort of resistance going to fight them off. This means that the game is very heavily focused on its faction system. Each one of the different factions has its own armor sets, its own skill trainers, and everything like that, and of course its own individual motivations, and you are welcome to join and ingratiate yourself with any of them that you want. You're actually given a very vague goal, and exactly how you accomplish it is up to you. And although I tend to really enjoy plots like that, where it's just like, here's the end goal, how you accomplish it is your business, go, I gotta say that I don't really like the way that this game does it, but we'll get more onto that a little bit later when we talk about the story. But it is sort of a good setup, because you have this relatively interesting world with all these different factions doing their own things in their own little bubbles, and it's up to you to actually try and gather them together and make them stop fighting each other and actually pay attention to the main threat. And the factions of this world are actually pretty interesting. You have everyone from religious devotees just trying to sort of figure out why things are as bad as they are, to somewhat militant nature lovers and magic users, to drug-addicted, emotionless beings with advanced technology, to devotees of an ancient god of oblivion that are incredibly violent. There's a lot to choose from in this world, and then you have you yourself at the Bastion, which is a sort of neutral ground that it is up to you to decide how to build up. You gotta recruit various people to keep it guarded, to fortify it, and then try and choose from the factions as to who you actually want to work with you to stay at this fortified location and actually help to fight off the coming invasion. You start off as mostly a blank slate, and with every level you can put various points into your different stats. Each stat will improve different aspects of your character, from your melee damage to your range damage to your magic damage and things of that nature, as well as, of course, your standard equipment requirements, where every piece of gear you can find has some sort of stat requirement in order to equip and use it. Now, something that is peculiar to these more European-style RPGs is the idea of skill trainers, and that is that instead of getting skill points when you level up, you get learning points, and you have to find various trainers around the world, and you can cash in these learning points as well as some money to learn the various skills that they can teach you. And this is always a system that I like more in theory than in practice, because in theory it rewards you for exploring, it makes each different faction have more of a personality, because different ones will have different vendors and different skill trainers that can can train you in different things. And it makes sure that you want to explore the world as much as possible to find as many different things that you can be trained in as possible to make the character that you want. But in practice, what it often means is your level ups will feel quite empty until you're able to arbitrarily find the one character you need to find in order to be taught the thing that you want to make your character into in the first place. So although I like the idea of skill trainers, I usually find it kind of an annoying setup because it means that you can't make the character that you want right off the bat, and instead have to save up these points until you find the person that can train you in what you actually want. But still, whether or not I like it, I understand that it is a very interesting and kind of unique system for skill training and level ups and stuff, and I appreciate the fact that it exists, even if sometimes I find it kind of obnoxious. And right from the beginning, you're given pretty much free reign of the area and a jetpack. The jetpack is sort of the big new feature of the game, and it is very fun to use, although the controls for it are a bit janky, and it's very easy to accidentally throw yourself off a cliff or something with it. Once you get used to how it works, it is actually very fun to play around with because, well, it's a jetpack. Jetpacks tend to make almost everything better, and this game is no exception, so it is fun to explore around the world with a jetpack, and you can even upgrade the jetpack once you get enough of the stat requirements met, mostly like intelligence and constitution, I think. You can upgrade the jetpack in various ways, and you will need to because at first it's pretty weak, but eventually you'll gain the access to add things like retro rockets, which will save you from one lethal fall, and increasing its fuel capacity so you can actually use it for longer periods of time without it crapping out on you and flying into a cliff face and things like that. So it is a very fun system, and it is well integrated with the game because it has its own upgrade bench. And being a post-apocalyptic setting, there is of course a focus on item crafting, so you can find and buy various recipes around the world and up your skills in order to craft things. You can craft melee weapons, you can upgrade melee weapons in various ways to new forms, you can craft ammo for your various weaponry, and you can even get some points in chemistry and stuff to craft various potions and things, so there's quite a lot of stuff to make. Although I will admit that the game does not have a standard sense of progression, and that's very much to its detriment, because the game is a fan of randomly putting really high-level monsters in your way, even for low-level quests, and just kind of expecting you to deal with it. And that means the game doesn't so much have a difficulty curve or make it feel like you're organically getting stronger as you go, because it can just randomly drop super high-level monsters in your way for no reason. Even the introductory quests at the very beginning of the game for most of the factions will often pit you against super high-level enemies for absolutely no reason at all when you're supposed to be doing these things at the very beginning of the game. I mean, it'll send enemies at you that drop weapons and stuff with stat requirements up in the 60s and 80s when you start with 10 in every stat. Is that really the stuff that it should be throwing at you right at the very beginning of the game? It makes the game feel like it has absolutely no sense of pacing or flow at all, because you start randomly flailing against whatever it throws at you, and you end randomly flailing against whatever it throws at you, and there's not really much progression in between. You get shinier equipment and stuff, yeah, and each of the factions has their own different weapons and techniques to offer, which is nice, but when the game seems to have no real sense of scaling or anything, and everything is just sort of randomly thrown at you in a big mass, it all feels like a very confusing, tangled mess at times. And then there's stuff like this. This game is also a mess in the technical sense. The optimization in larger areas is very poor. The frame rate will tank no matter how good of a system you have, it seems. And oftentimes in the big main faction towns, the textures and models will start to just flicker and pop in and out randomly. People will suddenly just be floating hairdos with no heads, even when you're in the middle of conversation with them, or their torsos will disappear, so they'll be floating limbs attached to nothing, like some sort of parallel universe Rayman. And this kind of thing happens every single time you're in one of the main faction towns for more than a couple of minutes. This is not a rare occurrence, which is a huge problem because you're going to be in these towns a lot. To introduce yourself, to find trainers, to find merchants, to turn in quests, to get new quests, you're spending a lot of time in these towns, and every single one of them does this to varying degrees. But I think the real reason that I bounced off this game so hard is the story. Now, I don't think it's necessarily a bad story, but I find it very difficult to care about because it doesn't really seem like anyone in the story cares about it either. Here's the thing, the story just doesn't really make a lot of sense to me personally, because if the idea is that there's this big world-ending human extincting invasion, shouldn't everyone already care about that by default? Or otherwise, how much of a threat really is it if it didn't make anyone care about it? Why should I have to go around the world convincing everyone that they should want to be alive next week? I don't really understand. I don't find any of the characters in this game interesting or likable, and I don't feel that any of the factions are pretty much anything more than just slightly different flavors of incredibly selfish jerks. And I found it really hard to get invested in this story when it just doesn't really make sense to me from the very beginning. I mean, look at something like Fallout New Vegas. That's a story that has a lot of factions and interfaction warfare and stuff like that, so it goes for a sort of similar idea. In Fallout New Vegas, you don't have to convince anyone that the war for the Hoover Dam is important. You don't have to convince Mr. House that he wants the platinum chip. Everyone already has their own motivations that make a certain degree of logical sense to them, and you're just some guy. You have to convince everyone that you're important by actually taking part in these events and making yourself important. That story makes a lot of sense to me. The factions have their own motivations that make sense to me. I get what's going on in something like Fallout New Vegas, but in this game I feel that every faction is just sort of content to remain in its own little bubble, not caring about anything or anyone other than themselves, and this supposedly huge world-ending invasion just doesn't really matter to anyone. And I found the game to feel very aimless, because you're just sort of expected to decide which faction you want to side with, and you're just given the locations of each of the faction's leaders. So it's up to you to go to each one individually and, explore what they're about and get to know them and maybe join them. And I appreciate the game's open narrative, basically giving you a general goal, fortify the Bastion, get people to work with us at the Bastion, fight off the invasion, but it's up to you to decide which of the factions you actually want to be at our side. I like that idea. But there's so little direction and so little motivation for me that it just kind of feels like I'm doing everyone's busy work as a random, unimportant errand boy in order to try and convince them that they should be taking this threat seriously, and I don't really get it. Sometimes it can be hard to understand what you should actually be doing with your time, because the game is actually so open that I feel that it's maybe to its detriment a little bit. It's almost too open, because you don't really have any direction. You're just sort of directionlessly wandering aimlessly around the place trying to find someone that needs help. And the moment that made me finally drop the game was that I decided to join the Berserkers, because they seem like the only faction that actually cares at least a little bit about the world other than themselves, so it made me want to actually join them. And as my first mission for joining them, to actually start going through their ranks and, improving my standing with them and stuff, I have to steal something from one of their own members. But in order to steal this thing, I need medium lockpicking skill. So I had to grind up a level and find the lockpicking trader and grind up my stats enough to be able to purchase medium lockpicking, which was kind of tedious, but that's just what comes along with the territory of having trainers and high skill requirements and stuff. I understand that's how RPGs like this work, so that's what I did. I finally got medium lockpicking, and I went to pick the lock, and I couldn't do it. I tried. The lockpicking minigame is not very well explained, and I have absolutely no idea how to do it. I can pick the easier locks just fine, but the harder locks, I cannot figure it out. I broke every single lockpick I had, was out of ideas, and decided that I was done. I was done playing. I was not having fun. This didn't feel like something that I should be doing as part of my main quest to save the world. It just doesn't make any sense to me. Now, I actually pick real locks in real life as a hobby. I find lockpicking to be very therapeutic, and it also helps with the problems I have with my hands, so it's really fun to do. It's just a fun hobby. And I gotta say that picking locks in this game is actually harder than doing it in real life in some aspects. Kind of like how catching a fish in Stardew Valley is somewhat harder than catching a fish in real life at times. Yeah, the lockpicking minigame is very authentic, which I appreciate, but I also don't really understand exactly how I'm supposed to do it sometimes. So I appreciate its authenticity, but at the same time, it is very hard. But anyway, it wasn't just the fact that the lockpicking was hard that put me off the game, it was just that I felt like I wasn't having fun. I'm sure if I felt the motivation to grind out some more money and get some more lockpicks, I eventually actually could figure it out, but I just didn't have that motivation. The game was giving me a headache to play every single time I booted it up because of the camera. The story and characters were just not interesting to me and made no real sense to me, so I didn't have any motivation. And the overall mechanics, like the combat and the lockpicking and the skill trainers, were all just a little bit too clunky for me, and I just wasn't having fun, so I dropped it. Now, just because I bounced off of it does not mean that you will, and even though I have some problems with the game, I don't believe it's actually a bad game. If what you've seen in the background has interested you, then you should probably check it out yourself, because it is a specific kind of RPG that I'm glad still exists, that isn't made that often, and that I always like to try out, because like I said, I've enjoyed games like the Gothic games and like Two Worlds 2 in the past, so I'm always up for a game like this. I love my weird, obscure European RPGs, and I'm glad they're still being made, but this one in particular just did not click for me personally. I had too many grievances with it, and it just wasn't a good time. So that is my current look at ELEX II, an interesting beast. Perhaps you'll enjoy it more than I did. So the link will be in the description below this video to the Steam store page if you would like to check it out yourself. Thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.